This video will change your perception of the Victorian era. Behind the majestic facades of Victorian buildings, resembling the country estates of aristocrats, lay a world that was not talked about. They were built far from cities, surrounded by picturesque parks and gardens, promising peace and healing. But behind the beautiful picture lay a system where human dignity lost all value. These walls witnessed not medical breakthroughs, but sophisticated experiments on the human mind and body. Hospitals, which were supposed to be a refuge for the suffering, actually turned into prisons for the undesirable. Society preferred to hide its madmen, getting rid of them under the pretext of care. Watch the video to the end to find out how ordinary laziness or reading novels could be grounds for life imprisonment, and why doctors considered forced labor on a farm to be the best cure for depression. I will reveal the most closely guarded secret of these institutions. The architecture of Victorian sanatoriums was not just a choice of style, but a well-thought-out tool of control. Many of them were built according to the so-called Kirkbride plan, which featured long, fan-shaped wings of the building. This layout allowed patients to be isolated from each other depending on their condition and social status. The further away from the central building, the more troublesome the patients were considered to be. This created a strict hierarchy within the institution. The long, straight corridors were designed not for convenience, but for total surveillance. One guard standing at the end of the corridor could see the doors of all the wards. This created a constant feeling among patients that they were being watched. Huge, often barred windows served a dual purpose. They provided good lighting, which was considered beneficial for mental health, but at the same time prevented patients from leaving the building. Patients were prisoners in a sunny prison. Large parks and farms were laid out around the sanatoriums, but they too were part of the control system. High walls and fences around the perimeter of the grounds made escape virtually impossible. Patients were allowed to walk, but only within strictly defined boundaries. Outwardly, these buildings often imitated Gothic castles or luxurious mansions. This technique was designed to appeal to wealthy families, who were more willing to send their relatives to a place that resembled a sanatorium rather than a prison. The facade concealed the true state of affairs. Self-sufficiency was a key principle. The grounds had their own laundries, kitchens, workshops, and farms where patients worked. This not only reduced the cost of their maintenance, but also made the hospital a closed ecosystem, isolated from the outside world. The central administrative building was always the most richly decorated. It housed the doctors and management offices and was where visitors were received. The contrast between the ceremonial part and the poor conditions in the distant wings was striking. Even the location of the wards was carefully thought out. Quiet and calm patients were placed in rooms with a beautiful view of the garden. The violent ones were placed in wards with windows facing blank walls or farm buildings. In this way, the entire structure of the building was designed to suppress the will and establish order. The architecture became a silent overseer, working 24 hours a day. We would be very interested to hear your opinion. What do you think about this approach, where architecture itself becomes an instrument of oppression? Please share your thoughts in the comments. Are you ready to learn the truth about how easy it was to lose your freedom in the Victorian era? The reasons why a person could end up in an asylum seem absurd today. No serious diagnosis was required. It was enough to differ from the generally accepted norms. A woman could be sent for treatment for being overly emotional, disobeying her husband, or even for her fondness for reading novels. Such activities were considered harmful to a woman's psyche and could be interpreted as symptoms of hysteria. All it took was the signatures of 2 doctors for a man to have his wife isolated for a long time. Financial motives also played a huge role. Greedy relatives could declare their rich uncle or aunt insane in order to take possession of their estate. The examination procedure was formal, and the opinion of potential heirs was often decisive. Socially deviant behavior was another common reason. Poverty, vagrancy, and alcoholism were all seen not as social problems, but as signs of moral and mental decay. The asylum became a convenient way to clean up the streets of undesirable elements. Even political dissent could land someone behind bars in a hospital ward. It was easier to declare people with inconvenient views insane than to engage in public debate with them. It was an effective way to silence opponents. Doctors at the time had a very vague understanding of mental illness. Diagnoses were made based on external manifestations, in terms such as melancholy, hysteria, or mania could mean anything. Any deviation from Victorian restraint aroused suspicion. The hospitalization procedure was remarkably simple. Often, all it took was a statement from a family member and a brief examination by a doctor, which could last only a few minutes. Getting discharged from the hospital was incomparably more difficult than getting admitted. Patients had virtually no rights. They could not challenge their diagnosis or refuse prescribed procedures. The word of the doctor in the administration was law, and any resistance was seen as another manifestation of the illness. Many of those who ended up in these institutions were not insane in the medical sense of the word. They were simply different, inconvenient, superfluous. The system was created not so much to treat as to isolate. Do you think that modern society has completely eliminated the practice of isolating inconvenient people under various pretexts? In the next chapter, we will learn how labor that was supposed to heal actually turned into a form of exploitation. What I am about to show you is banned in 12 countries. Victorian-era doctors believed in the concept of moral therapy. They believed that a strict daily routine and physical labor could restore order and harmony to a troubled mind. In practice, this resulted in a system of legalized exploitation. Patients had to work 10-12 hours a day. Men worked on farms and gardens and blacksmiths or carpentry workshops. Women did sewing, laundry, cleaning, and kitchen work. This system made the hospital almost completely self-sufficient. It provided itself with food, clothing, and everything else it needed. The patient's labor was free, which brought the administration huge savings. Working in the laundry rooms was considered one of the hardest jobs. Women stood for hours in stuffy, damp rooms, washing huge amounts of laundry by hand in boiling water and caustic alkalis. It was exhausting and harmful to their health. The men who worked in the fields performed all agricultural tasks from sowing to harvesting. They worked in all weather conditions, using primitive tools. Such labor was little different from hard labor. Doctors claimed that monotonous physical labor distracted patients from painful thoughts and obsessive ideas. They believed that physical exhaustion led to peace of mind. In reality, it was simply physical and mental exhaustion. Refusal to work was impossible. It was considered a symptom of illness and disobedience. Such patients could be punished by being deprived of food, walks, or by applying more severe therapeutic measures. The results of the patient's labor were often sold. Hospitals supplied vegetables, milk, furniture, and clothing to nearby towns, generating additional income. This economic benefit was a powerful incentive to maintain the system of forced labor. There was no division based on ability or health status. A melancholic poet and a violent patient with hallucinations could find themselves at the same workbench or in the same field. The main goal was to make everyone work. Thus, work therapy was not a treatment, but the economic foundation on which the entire system was based. It allowed thousands of people to be supported at minimal cost. It was an ideal business model, cloaked in humane slogans. What if I showed you a time machine? One of the most common methods of treatment in Victorian sanatoriums was hydrotherapy. Doctors of the time believed that water had miraculous powers and could affect the nervous system. In practice, these procedures were far from pleasant spa rituals. There were many varieties of hydrotherapy. One of the most popular was the ice bath. The patient was placed in a bathtub filled with cold, often icy water, and left there for several hours. It was believed that such a temperature shock could cool the heated brain of a violent patient and bring them to their senses. To prevent the person from getting out, the bath was often covered with a lid or tarpaulin, leaving only an opening for the head. This procedure could last until the patient lost consciousness. Another method involved shower treatments. The patient was tied to the wall and subjected to a powerful jet of ice-cold water under high pressure. Doctors believed that this massage stimulated blood circulation and calmed the nerves. Hot baths were also sometimes used, but they were also taken to extremes. The patient could be kept in very hot water for hours, bringing them to complete exhaustion. It was believed that this helped with melancholy by dissolving bad thoughts. Another procedure was a wet wrap. The person was wrapped in a wet, cold sheet and then tightly wrapped in several layers of woolen blankets. The body gradually warmed up, but the patient remained completely immobile for many hours. The hydrotherapy equipment looked impressive and medical. Complex systems of pipes, taps, pressure gauges, and bizarrely shaped baths were intended to convince people of the scientific nature of the approach. Behind this complexity lay simple and crude methods of treatment. No anesthesia or painkillers were used. The patient's suffering was considered an inevitable part of the healing process. It was believed that healing came through overcoming discomfort. These methods were not only used on violent patients. They could be prescribed for the slightest disobedience or simply as a preventive measure. The decision to perform the procedure depended entirely on the will of the doctor or even a simple orderly. Hydrotherapy was a striking example of how medical theory based on conjecture rather than fact could give rise to cruel practices. Water, the source of life, became an instrument of control and oppression. In the next chapter, you will learn what other devices were used to subdue patients. In addition to hydrotherapy, mechanical restraints became widely used. Doctors believed that completely restricting movement helped calm the mind and prevent patients from harming themselves or others. There was a wide variety of such devices. The classic straitjacket was the most famous device. It was a thick canvas shirt with very long sleeves that were tied behind the back. This completely deprived the person of the ability to use their hands. There were also more complex devices, such as the calm chair. It was a massive wooden chair to which the patient was tied with leather straps around their arms, legs, and torso. Sometimes a box was added to cover the head in order to deprive the patient of visual and auditory stimuli. Some hospitals used special beds with straps and nets. Patients could be kept tied to such beds for days or even weeks. They had to relieve themselves on the bed. For particularly difficult cases, metal restraints resembling shackles were used. They were placed on the wrists and ankles and connected with a chain. In this state, the person could move, but their movements were restricted and difficult. The purpose of these devices was not treatment, but to ensure order and staff safety. When there was a shortage of orderlies, it was easier to restrain a restless patient than to try to find a way to deal with them. It was a measure of convenience for the administration. Prolonged immobilization had serious consequences for physical health. It led to muscle atrophy, bed sores, and circulatory disorders. But these side effects were considered a lesser evil compared to violent behavior. Some reform-minded doctors tried to combat the use of mechanical restraints by introducing a system of unrestraint. However, their ideas were slow to catch on. Most hospitals continued to actively use straps and straitjackets. The psychological impact of such measures was devastating. Complete helplessness and humiliation only exacerbated the patient's condition. Instead of being calmed, they suffered new psychological trauma. These devices were a symbol of the impotence of Victorian psychiatry. Unable to treat the cause of the disease, doctors fought its symptoms in the most crude and direct way possible, by completely suppressing physical freedom. Want to know a secret that will change your view of medicine? Victorian doctors were constantly looking for new ways to influence the brain. Some of their experiments seem like the product of a sick imagination today, but at the time they were considered cutting-edge science. One such method was rotation therapy. The patient was placed in a special chair suspended from the ceiling and spun at high speed. It was believed that this caused a redistribution of blood in the brain and could shake the patient out of a state of stupor or melancholy. The procedure was stopped when the person began to experience severe nausea and dizziness. These physiological reactions were considered a positive therapeutic effect. In essence, the patient was brought to a state of extreme physical discomfort. With the advent of electricity, doctors saw it as a powerful new tool. The nascent electrotherapy quickly found application in hospitals. It was not yet modern electroshock therapy, but rather crude experiments with passing current through the body. Electrodes were applied to different parts of the body, including the head, and discharges of varying strength and duration were administered. Doctors believed that electricity could restart the nervous system, similar to how it causes muscles to contract. The consequences of such procedures were unpredictable. Some specialists went even further, combining different methods. For example, a patient could be exposed to ice water and electric shocks at the same time. It was believed that this enhanced the therapeutic effect. All these procedures were performed without anesthesia. Any reaction from the patient, whether it was screaming or loss of consciousness, was interpreted by doctors within the framework of their theories. Of course, there was no objective data on the effectiveness of these methods. These experiments were the result of a complete misunderstanding of the nature of mental illness. The brain was seen as a simple mechanism that could be fixed through rough physical manipulation, whether through rotation, water, or electricity. Today, such methods would definitely be classified as cruel treatment. But in the Victorian era, they were carried out under the auspices of science and with a sincere belief in their healing power. This shows how dangerous medicine can be when it is detached from evidence and ethics. Which modern medical procedures do you think may seem wild and barbaric in the future? In the next chapter, we will talk about those who carried out all these methods, the staff of medical institutions. Hospital staff played a key role in maintaining the system. However, their qualifications and moral qualities often left much to be desired. The work of an orderly was hard, low-paid, and not prestigious. These positions were often filled by people with no education or special training. They could be former soldiers, ruined farmers, or simply people who had found no other place in life. They had no knowledge of psychology or medicine. Their main task was to maintain order and discipline. They had to feed the patients, monitor their hygiene, and suppress any signs of aggression or disobedience. In fact, they performed the functions of prison guards. Due to low wages and harsh working conditions, staff turnover was enormous. This led to random and sometimes cruel people working in the hospitals. Power over defenseless patients corrupted and provoked abuse. The ratio of staff to patients was extremely low. 1 or 2 orderlies could be responsible for an entire wing housing dozens or even hundreds of people. In such conditions, an individual approach was impossible. Doctors rarely spent time with patients. They made rounds, prescribed procedures, and did administrative work. All the daily dirty work fell on the shoulders of junior staff. Female staff worked in women's wards, but their situation was no better. Nurses and nursing assistants were also overworked and received meager salaries. Their main function was supervision, not care. There were exceptions, people who sincerely tried to help patients. But within the rigid hierarchical system, their efforts were often in vain. Any show of compassion could be seen as weakness. Patients were totally at the mercy of the orderlies. Complaining about abuse was pointless, as no one believed the words of a madman. This created the perfect conditions for impunity. Thus, the system itself bred violence and indifference. It attracted people who were willing to follow orders without asking questions. Incompetent and demotivated staff were as much a part of the system of oppression as straitjackets. Victorian asylums were not just medical institutions. They performed an important social function, the isolation of undesirable elements. Society at that time was obsessed with ideas of order, propriety, and control. People with mental disorders did not fit into this picture. Their behavior was unpredictable, frightening, and disruptive to public peace. Therefore, the simplest solution was to remove them from sight. The asylum became a kind of dumping ground for human destinies. Anyone who did not meet the strict standards of Victorian morality was sent there. It was part of a broader process of social hygiene. It was believed that mental illness, like poverty or crime, was hereditary. Therefore, isolating such people was seen as a way to prevent the degeneration of the nation. They were not allowed to marry or have children. A family with a mad member experienced enormous shame. It was considered a stain on their reputation. Therefore, relatives often sought to get rid of such a family member as quickly and discreetly as possible. After being admitted to a hospital, a person was effectively erased from life. They lost all civil rights, and their property was placed under guardianship. Returning to society after this was practically impossible. Even if a patient managed to be discharged, they were forever branded as a former lunatic. It was extremely difficult to find a job, start a family, or simply re-establish social connections. Society did not accept them back. Hospitals actively supported this fear and prejudice. They were closed institutions, surrounded by secrets and rumors. This reinforced the perception of them as places inhabited by dangerous and unpredictable creatures, rather than sick people. Newspapers of the time often published sensational stories about escaped patients, portraying them as monsters. This shaped public opinion and justified the existence of a harsh system of isolation. Thus, hospitals were an instrument of social control that helped Victorian society maintain the illusion of its own well-being and normality. The price of this illusion was thousands of broken lives. Despite the overall cruelty of the system, voices calling for change were already being heard in the Victorian era. These were doctors, journalists, and public figures who saw the inhumanity of existing practices and tried to fight them. One of the key areas of reform was the fight for the unrestraint of patients. Doctors such as John Connolly in England advocated the complete abandonment of mechanical restraints. They argued that kindness and patience worked better than straps and chains. The reformers tried to change the very atmosphere in the hospitals. They introduced entertainment into the schedule, dancing, music, and theatrical performances. They sought to create an environment that would not suppress but stimulate the healthy part of the patient's personality. Journalists also played an important role. Conducting their own investigations, they infiltrated hospitals posing as patients or staff and described the horrors there in newspapers. Such publications caused a public outcry and forced the authorities to respond. One of the most famous such journalists was the American Nellie Bly. In 1887, she feigned insanity in order to be admitted to a women's hospital on Blackwell's Island. Her book, 10 Days in a Madhouse, exposed the appalling conditions there and led to serious reforms. Reformers also fought to change the law. They demanded that the procedure for involuntary hospitalization be made more difficult and that patients be given more rights. They insisted on the introduction of independent oversight of the activities of hospitals. These efforts were met with fierce resistance from the conservative part of the medical community and officials. Many doctors sincerely believed in the effectiveness of the old methods and did not want to change anything. Hospital administrators feared losing cheap labor. The process of humanizing psychiatry was very slow and uneven. Some hospitals introduced progressive methods, while others remained islands of the Middle Ages. But the first steps had been taken. Nevertheless, even the most progressive reformers were still trapped in the misconceptions of their time. They could not offer effective treatment, as science did not yet understand the causes of mental disorders. Their main achievement was that they forced society to recognize the existence of the problem. They restored the status of asylum patients as people deserving of compassion, not just isolation. Their work laid the foundation for future changes in psychiatry. By the beginning of the 20th century, the Victorian model of huge isolated hospitals was beginning to fail. They were overcrowded, chronically underfunded, and unable to cope with their task. It became clear that simply warehousing people did not solve the problem. The emergence of new medical theories, in particular Sigmund Freud's psychoanalysis, changed the view of the nature of mental illness. It became clear that its causes could lie in the psychology of the individual, and not just in the physiology of the brain. This required new approaches to treatment based on conversation rather than coercion. A real revolution in psychiatry occurred in the mid-20th century with the discovery of neuroleptics. These drugs made it possible for the first time to effectively relieve the most severe symptoms, such as delirium and hallucinations. Medicine gained a tool that could replace the straitjacket. The advent of effective drugs made it possible to treat patients outside of hospitals. A process of deinstitutionalization began, the mass closure of large psychiatric hospitals, and a transition to outpatient care. Thousands of patients who had spent decades in isolation were given the opportunity to return to society. This process also had its negative sides. Many former patients were not ready for independent living, and the promised outpatient support system was not established everywhere. Some of them joined the ranks of the homeless. The old Victorian hospitals began to fall into disrepair. Their huge, gloomy buildings, designed to accommodate hundreds and thousands of beds, were no longer needed. Many of them were abandoned and gradually fell into ruin, becoming ghosts of the past. Today, these buildings evoke mixed feelings. On the one hand, they are architectural monuments of their era. On the other, they are memorials to thousands of people whose lives were crippled within their walls. The history of these hospitals is an important reminder of how easily society can create a repressive system under the guise of care and treatment. It shows how dangerous medical theories can be when they are not backed up by scientific evidence and humanism. The experience of the Victorian era forced a rethinking of the very concept of psychiatric care. Modern psychiatry, for all its problems, strives for respect for patient rights, an individual approach, and integration into society rather than isolation. The legacy of those times serves as a constant warning. It teaches us to be cautious about any treatment methods based on suppression and coercion, and to remember that behind every diagnosis, there is first and foremost a human being. We have lifted the veil of secrecy on one of the darkest phenomena of the Victorian era. Hospitals, which were supposed to be a safe haven, turned out to be a testing ground for cruel social and medical experiments. Behind the facade of a scientific approach and humane goals lay a system of isolation and control. The history of these institutions is not just a collection of facts about the past, it is a lesson in how dangerous it is when fear and ignorance dictate attitudes towards those who are different from the majority. It is a reminder of the fragility of human dignity and the importance of protecting the rights of the most vulnerable. What do you think about this page of history? What lessons do you think modern society should learn from the experience of Victorian asylums? Suggest topics for future videos you would like to see in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel.